to ratify. You mentioned 9/13. What was 9/13?
I don't know.
Okay, what was 9/13?
To make the Constitution.
9/13 was the fraction that would allow the Constitution to be legal. We talked about some other fractions too. What were the other fractions? 3/5 compromise. What was that?
3 slaves for every no. Yeah, 5 slaves for every 3 people.
5 slaves for every 3 people.
1 slave equals 3/5 of a vote. Or 3/5 of
1 slave equals 3/5 of a vote. Boy, this is getting complicated.
Each slave was counted as a 3/5 of a person.
3/5 of a person. Okay, so basically you had, basically in the Constitution, if you remember back in the day, the South wanted all of the slaves to count as a person, not for rights, but for representation. The North didn't want them to count at all. The North wanted the slaves to count as 1 person for taxation purposes. The South didn't want them to count at all for taxation purposes. So they compromised and came up with 3/5. And they said 5 slaves would equal 3 people. So in the big picture of things, if you've got, well, I'm not even trying to do the math, but the bottom line is they would count the slaves, and then 3/5 of the slaves would be counted. They would use 3/5 of the number of slaves to count for representation purposes, and then the South would get extra seats. But 3/5 of the number of the slaves would equal to the amount of taxes ultimately that the South would pay to the federal government. So neither side got everything that they wanted, but both sides kind of got to stick it to the other one. What was the significance, though? I mean, if you say that somebody is 3/5, or it takes 5 slaves to equal 3 people, you're saying that a slave is really less than human or less than a person, and that was actually part of the Constitution that was legal. Go ahead, Breonna. I think I saw your hand.
I had ratification.
Ratification was 9/13. That's the 9/13 fraction. So it took 9 colonies of the 13. And why did they use 9/13 and not all 13?
They wouldn't all vote.
Because there was a sense that not all 13 of them were going to ratify it, and they wanted to make sure that the Constitution passed. Just to kind of jump from this for a second, going back to the articles, if you remember, we did talk about the court endorses the land grab, which was eminent domain. That was one we talked about in reference to the idea that that developer could come in and take the homes away from the poor neighborhoods and then ultimately develop them with condominiums and shopping malls and restaurants. What was the trick with eminent domain? When is it typically allowed, and when is it typically not allowed?
It's allowed when, like, I don't know, if they were to take down the houses to build something that would like benefit everybody there in
Like
the
a
community.
So, for example, if Betty had a nut farm and they wanted to build a road through the nut farm in order to make it an easier travel, then that would be something everybody would use the road. Okay, that's typically allowed. So eminent domain says the government can come in and pay you what a reasonable person would pay, and then indeed they would provide a project there that everybody, public use, everybody would use. Now the problem with eminent domain is, if you remember, this was going to be for malls, houses, this was going to be for restaurants, things that not everybody would use. Initially it was okayed, but if you remember, George W. signed an executive order that said, no, we're not going to do this. So technically eminent domain for that purpose was not allowed at the end of the Bush presidency. What else do y'all, articles. Okay, that was the first one. We talked about hot pursuit. OnStar, there's a link. Take a look at the link. It's a joke, but it's talking about, convoluted uses of OnStar having a pimp come in and get a prostitute out of your car. But OnStar, with the high-speed chases we talked about. We talked about the FBI and the drug rules. And if you remember, with the FBI and the drug rules, what is FBI policy?
If you've used drugs, marijuana 15 times in your life, you shouldn't apply.
15 times or more, or within the past 3 years. Was it 3 years?
3 or 5.
Was it 3 or was it 5?
I think it was 3.
I think it was 3.
It was 10 for coke. It's 3? Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, if you had used drugs within the past 3 years, or if you had used it more than 15 times in your life, they said don't apply. What was the problem that the FBI was having with that restrictive drug policy?
Everybody smokes. And it was, I don't know.
Just because everybody in Brazil smokes, don't generalize that here. Okay.
That's not true. Okay. Well, there are a lot of people is using drugs, and they might, a lot of qualified people might not be able to join the FBI because they.
Yeah, the FBI. So which part of it did they remove? Did they remove the 15 times, or did they remove the 3 years? They removed the 15 times. FBI policy basically says that if you have used weed within the last 3 years, then you should not apply. But if you've used it as many times as you needed to or wanted to or whatever, couldn't control yourself for, whatever the case might be in your life, you can still apply as long as it was 3 years ago or longer. And again, the sense was that because it was so restrictive, they weren't having enough qualified candidates. Everybody was being, if you remember, I asked y'all to raise your hands. How many of you would not be able, or your friend, you know, had fallen within those categories? So many people raised their hands, the FBI just didn't have qualified applicants. So that one was one, the FBI drug policy. I had also given you okay, we talked about ERA, I got that out of the way. The assault on separation of powers. And if you remember, what was the key thing that you needed in that assault on separation of powers article? It said in there, because we were talking, if you remember with separation of powers, we were talking about executive branch, legislative branch, and courts. And if the government needed to do something, how did those branches have to interact? Two of them. Two of them had to agree. And you're right, it does fall under checks and balances. And what we were talking about, if you remember, if you wanted to pass a law, you had to have Congress pass the law, and you had to have the executive's consent. If you wanted to get a warrant, you had to have an executive order, you know, requesting this, but then the courts had to approve it. If you wanted to convict somebody, you had to have an executive prosecution, and you had to have the courts actually convict the person based on this prosecution. So you needed 2 of the 3 branches. That was the big issue with that. And then who has the power to send troops to war? Who has the power to declare war?
Congress.
Congress has the power to declare war. Who has the power to make it? The President does. And what was the power, the law that we talked about? War powers resolution. How many days?
60 days.
President can send troops abroad for 60 days for any reason whatsoever, as long as he notifies the leading members of both parties in Congress. But on day 61, Congress has the ability to bring them back. We talked about the budget ones. Pay good attention to that link, because if you remember, there were 2 articles. One was the pork barrel article talking about where the government was wasting our tax dollars. The other one was basically how your taxes get spent. Do you remember about how much the government is collecting and how much it says it's spending? Yeah, they collect, I think it's like 20,080 or something, 20,044. And how much is it that they say that they're spending on you?
24.
23,760, something along those lines. And then it breaks down those categories. I don't get specific on a lot of the articles. These ones might need to be a little bit specific on, so kind of keep that in mind. That was the piggy, and that was the budget as far as the tax dollars. Any other terms from Chapter 2? Everybody as good can be? For Chapter 2, with the Constitution, have a pretty good idea of Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. We talked about those. Article 4 is up here, full faith and credit clause. Article 5 was the amendment article. Article 6, I don't have it up here, but what was Article 6? There were 2 parts to it. One is really big deal. Article 6, you're not required to take a religious oath, and then there was the one that was the really big deal. Supremacy clause. And what does the supremacy clause say, Solomon?
That the Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and if there is a state law that's contrary, or if Congress does something that's inconsistent, or the President, then indeed that is null and void, because the Constitution is most powerful. Chapter 3. Y'all got any questions from Chapter 3?